Hi, welcome to History Doodles. My name's Mitch, and today we're going to be building a timeline between two of the greatest leaders of the ancient world, Xerxes and Alexander. We're going to be talking about all the major events that happened between the two, ending with Alexander's conquest in the east. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So I think the natural place to start here is with the Persian Empire. In 480 BC, Xerxes was at the helm of it, and he was the next in line in the Achaemenid dynasty, which was a dynasty that had ruled the Persian Empire since inception and was producing some of the greatest leaders the Middle East has ever seen, like Cyrus the Great, Darius. Cambyses wasn't maybe awesome, but either way, Xerxes is now at the helm, and he's got a huge army with plans from his father on what to do next. So at the time of his death, his father, Darius, was basically obsessed with trying to get Greece incorporated into the empire and had been held up by the Athenians basically on the way. So by 480, the army is in Asia Minor, staging and waiting. And the Greeks, who wrote most of the written information we have from this time, spied on it and found out and returned home, basically writing that they had an army made up of 1.7 million men and 1,207 ships. Now, as with most ancient history, those numbers are almost definitely wildly exaggerated. I've seen modern estimates around a tenth of that. But either way, it shows the Greeks were absolutely terrified of this giant force coming from the Middle East into Europe. And initially, this army just kind of rolled through Macedonia and Thrace and was stopped at a very little pass with a very famous name. That was Thermopylae. This is where the famous 300 Spartans would make their final stand that was in that cool movie. And it was an amazing stand. It was extremely heroic, and the Spartans put up a better fight than they had any business putting up. I have a cool quote here from historian Peter Green describing the fight as, "So Leonidas and his men stood at arms for the last time, silent because there was nothing left to say, waiting patiently as the August sun climbed the sky. Leonidas, determined to make this final engagement a costly one for the Persians, now moved his line forward, well beyond the wall, and deployed it on wider ground, where there would be more elbow room for slaughter." End quote. So Leonidas and his Spartans put up a great fight, but it ultimately was only really a delay and an annoyance to Xerxes, who after a week broke through this little defense line and was now into Attica, where he could rage through the countryside, burning crops, destroying temples and altars, and doing all the things that he had set out and planned to do. Soon Xerxes and his army made it into Athens, and they found the city mostly empty, for most of the citizens had evacuated to a nearby island of Salamis. There were some diehards holding out there, and they were killed, and the Acropolis was burned, and Xerxes sent a message back home to Susa in Persia to tell them that the war was over and that Xerxes had won. Now, this turns out to be a little bit premature, kind of like maybe George Bush in 2003 when he declared victory in the Iraq War. Because what happens next is basically Xerxes gets lured into a naval battle across the island of Salamis, and this decision was a terrible one for him, frankly. The historian Tom Holland describes this as, quote, "A decision as fateful as any in the history of warfare, for upon it rested the future course not merely of the battle, not merely of the war, but of Europe and Western civilization itself. Infuriatingly, we're not told when or why it was made, only that battle, when it was joined, did indeed take place where the Persians had been most desperate not to fight it, within the straits of Salamis." End quote. Basically, Salamis was a narrow strait that allowed the Persians to basically concentrate their ships and the Athenians on the other side to just ram into them with a wooden wall of triremes with iron tips that just mowed through, and Xerxes could see it all from the shore. His victory for the Greeks would lead to a snowballing effect that eventually saw the Persians evicted from Greece entirely at the Battle of Platea the next year, and Xerxes had to return home with his tail between his legs and was probably pretty disappointed at the loss of blood and treasure that he had wasted trying to conquer Greece. He was assassinated 15 years later by a member of his royal bodyguard, and the Persians had probably peaked during his lifetime, because ever after him, the Persians would still be a powerful regional player, but not the unstoppable superpower that showed up on the shores of Greece. Next, basically, the Athenians used this naval success to catapult themselves into a new position of leadership in the Eastern Mediterranean. Their navy allowed them to expand their shipping operations and trade routes, and basically form a league of city-states like themselves called the Delian League that operated as a bulwark against the Persians, but in reality became a way for the Athenians to control the Eastern Mediterranean and make all the decisions and control the capital, keep everyone else in line. So this next century basically is the Athenian Golden Age. This period of peace and prosperity brought a cultural golden age to Athens. And many of the foundational thinkers of Western civilization came from this time. Herodotus, who I think I've mentioned before, came from this time. Also Socrates, Thucydides, many others basically formed the foundations of Western civilization here. And this Athenian supremacy continues for, probably until the 430s, when basically the Spartans and their allies had enough of this Athenian supremacy, and they decided to launch a surprise attack, basically. Their land army, which was unstoppable, marched into Attica and set fire to the countryside. Sound familiar? And all of the Athenians had to hide behind their city walls. The next year or so, the Athenians would be in a position where they were hiding behind their city walls, taking in refugees from the countryside, and basically just delaying and letting the Spartans burn all their crops, but not actually do anything past that point, while the Athenians actually just ferried in food into their long walls in Athens. The problem is, with this influx of people came a great plague. So all of the people coming in from the countryside made the town of Athens a lot less hospitable than might have otherwise been, and it was a breeding ground for disease. So it led to a plague that wiped out up to a fourth of the population of Athens. We still don't know what the plague actually was. Doctors still kind of speculate as to what it might have been, but Thucydides, the historian and general, wrote a list of symptoms saying, I have it here, quote, fever, inflammation, eye problems, sore and bloody throat, sneezing, hoarseness, chest pain, cough, intestinal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, skin eruptions and ulcers, thirst and dehydration, general weakness and fatigue, gangrene in the extremities, permanent brain damage, end quote. Not pretty. Basically, this war that caused this disease would drag on for the next 30 years, give or take, with some periods of peace in it. And it was basically a stalemate for a lot of the time because the Athenians couldn't ever get a major land victory against the Spartans, because every time they got a foothold and tried to advance further, the Spartans would boot them out. And the Spartans didn't have the siege or naval power to actually get into Athens and take out the city. All of that sort of comes to an end when the Spartans decide to invest more in their navy and get a brilliant naval commander named Lysander. Lysander went to the Persians and got some money to build a new fleet, and he used this fleet to basically hunt down Athenian grain ships, and you can see where this is going, try to starve out the Athenians that way. What really made the difference, though, is a battle, one of the most decisive naval battles in the history of naval warfare that Lysander found, and it was called the Battle of Aigospotamoi. Forgive me, I'm definitely not pronouncing that right, but the historian Victor Davis Hansen describes this battle in his book, A War Like No Other, as, quote, the result was abject slaughter. The Spartan fleet destroyed, disabled, or captured 170 out of 180 triremes, dispersed thousands of the oarsmen, and then executed 3,000 to 4,000 of the captured Athenian crews, sparing only the allies and slaves. This most decisive naval defeat in the history of the Greek city-state was not even really fought at sea. Rather, Lysander's triremes surprised thousands as they ate, slept, and lounged on the beach. So what happened was basically Lysander found all the Athenians docked and just foraging for food, and just rolled up on them and slaughtered them for a couple days. Terrible. I shouldn't be laughing, but it's weird how naval warfare ends up, I guess, sometimes. So within a few months, the Athenians couldn't continue the war anymore. The battle was annihilated them, and they had to concede to Spartan demands. Now, the Spartans would become the major prominent player in the region for the next little bit here, but they quickly learned that their skill was in warfare rather than administration, and the Spartan hegemony over the Greek world didn't last long. And then finally we get to the Macedonians. Basically, the Macedonians came out of nowhere. They weren't a major power player in the traditional classical Greek world. The classical Greeks kind of looked at the Macedonians like something like barbarians. They really didn't think of them as equals in culture to themselves. The Macedonians were famous for drinking a lot and practicing polyamory, which were two things that the Greeks were not down with. Historian Ian Worthington describes some of these differences, saying, quote, "Macedonia was utterly different. No one was allowed to wash in warm water except for women who had just given birth. No man could recline at a banquet until he had speared and killed one of the ferocious wild boars without using a net to trap it. A soldier had to wear a rope or sash around his waist until he killed his first man in battle. Macedonian society, then, was rugged and had more in common with the tough love of Homeric heroes or even Viking society than with any classical Greek." End quote. But basically, Macedonia was a sleeping giant, and they got a great man named Philip II who took this would-be powerful player and whipped him into shape. When Philip was a boy, he was sent to Thebes as a political captive. It was a common practice back then. I won't go into, but it is kind of weird. But anyway, he spent a couple years in Thebes, and he there learned a lot more about strategy and culture and the limitations of democracy than he might otherwise have if he hadn't had this opportunity. And he comes back to Macedonia, gets power, and starts overhauling the Macedonian economy first and foremost, which increased the mining operations in the nation and provided them that foundation to work off of. And then he revolutionized their military and created a professional fighting force. And then he started to make deals or conquer all of the neighboring kingdoms or tribes in the area. This worked out fabulously well. They were growing quite rapidly, and their power was clearly on the rise. And then he did what was probably his most lasting action in 356, which was marrying his fourth wife. He married a 17-year-old princess from Epirus, which is modern-day Albania. And she was one of the most interesting women in history, I could pretty confidently say. This woman was named Olympias, and she was extremely bold and intimidating. She would be a power player, ever after this point. And she was thought to possess magical powers by her contemporaries. And she was frequently accompanied by snakes and kind of lead into this witchy quality. Now, Olympias is an amazing person in her own right, but she is most famous for her role as a mother. For soon after her marriage to Philip, she gave him a baby boy named Alexander. Alexander would be known to history as Alexander the Great, and he would be emulated consciously by leaders forever after him, from Julius Caesar to Napoleon Bonaparte. So Alexander spent his youth basically being groomed by Philip and Olympias to be given the best possible opportunity to be a great king for the Macedonians. So kind of like Xerxes was 200 years before him, he was consciously trying to become the next great emperor. And he was even given Aristotle as a tutor when he was 14. And Alexander was up for the challenge. He was proving to be something of a prodigy. And by the time he was in his late teens, he started accompanying his father, Philip, on campaign. And, by the time he was 18, he was leading part of the Macedonian army. And they won some major battles between themselves and the Thebans and Athenians. And eventually, by the time Alexander was nearing 20, they were the undisputed rulers in Greece. So as Philip is riding high, Philip is celebrating the marriage of his daughter. During this ceremony, a man named Pausanias of Orestes comes up and stabs him multiple times in the ribs and then runs away. And Philip screams some stuff out and dies. The murderer, the assassin, Pausanias, is hunted down and killed on the spot. And basically everyone was just wondering what the hell just had happened. There were many theories as to what this series of events actually meant and who did it. And it's something that we're probably never going to know. Basically, theories on motive for Pausanias range from some sort of Persian interference to thoughts that Pausanias was involved in a homosexual relationship with Philip that had ended poorly and he felt spurned and he killed him that way. So clearly there's no consensus. A lot of people also think that Alexander and Olympias had a hand in the assassination because Alexander's relationship with his father was really rocky at this time, as was Olympias's was with him. And right after the murder, Alexander becomes king, and he gets, he's 20 and he gets to be leader of this giant budding superpower. So totally possible. I'm not going to really speculate here, but whatever happens next is Alexander gains this army and all of its support, and he starts going on campaign. So he consolidates power in Greece, sets up basically a secure home front, and then takes about 50,000 troops and, much like Xerxes in reverse, crosses the Hellespont with conquest on his mind. And he enters into Asia, and he wins a series of decisive battles for the next couple of years against the Persians. He takes his army into Asia Minor, wins some battles there, takes his army into the ancient Phoenician cities like Tyre, has some amazing victories there, and then makes it all the way into Egypt and takes that without a fight. The Persians, led by their king at the time, Darius III, make their final stand at a place called Gaugamela, which is near modern-day Mosul. And Darius III brought in scythe chariots and elephants and 100,000 men to this battle. And he was going to make this last stand here and defeat Alexander. Alexander was vastly outnumbered, but had superior strategy for the fight. And it allowed him to win, basically causing Darius to flee and abandon his army. And he also weirdly left behind his children and all of his wives, who would be taken in and treated actually pretty well by the Macedonians. After this fight, Alexander continues his campaign eastward into the ancient cities of Persepolis and Pasargadae, and there he didn't hold back. The cities were basically destroyed. His Macedonians killed indiscriminately, and Pasargadae was burned to the ground. Alexander kept pushing and pushing with his army into the Eurasian steppe and all the way into like the modern day Punjab in India. So his Greek army was now fighting against elephants in the jungle, and at this point, I think his army was probably a bit too tired to go any further. Ian Worthington describes what his men must have been feeling as they marched into these crazy foreign lands, saying, quote, "The army marched further inland, saturated, probably suffering from dysentery, snake bites, trench foot, exhaustion, and depression," end quote. And also, meanwhile, Alexander, so his army is not in a good spot mentally. They're like, what the hell are we doing here? And Alexander himself is pretty much slowly losing his fucking mind. He starts acting like an actual god. At one point, he had been told by a oracle in Siwa in Egypt that he was a god. So he took that to heart. And he started acting more like an Asian than a Macedonian. So his troops hated that. A lot of the old guard of Macedonians hated that. Also, he thought he was starting to think he was like literally some sort of god. Went to his head, was not handling it well. A contemporary source described the situation as, quote, "Very often he wore a lion skin and carried a club, just like Heracles. Alexander used to have the floor sprinkled with exquisite perfumes and fragrant wine. Myrrh and other kind of incense were burnt before him. Although all those in his presence stayed silent or spoke just a few good words of omen because of their fear, for he was a very violent man, with no regard for human life, and appeared to have been a person of melancholic constitution." So Alexander is slowly losing his mind. His troops have no more of this, and eventually he decides this can go no further. And I think at 326, he basically fashions a fleet, goes down the Indus River into the ocean, and then goes back to the Near East. And after a pretty tumultuous journey back home, he switches from conquer mode to administer mode, and now has to basically lead and be the king of the largest empire that the world had ever seen. He even had a little marriage ceremony where he tried to get all of his senior staff to marry into Persian royal women to kind of merge the East and West. And you can see what his vision was, but it was not to last, because in 323, Alexander would perish. At the time, he was staying at Nebuchadnezzar's palace in Babylon, and was convinced by a friend to stay up one night and have a night of typical Macedonian heavy drinking. Apparently, this night he finished off an entire pitcher of wine by himself, and at one point in the night he collapsed on the floor and went into violent spasms. He would never recover from this, and within a week he was dead. Many at the time thought that there was foul play. They assumed that he had been poisoned. Others thought it was some sort of disease like malaria that he could have contracted in the jungles in the east. And, other people thought it's the natural result of a lifelong habit of binge drinking like that. But whatever the cause is, the king was dead, and his empire that was really just created starts getting carved up by his generals almost immediately. And major dynasties form in Egypt, Syria, Greece, and they would war with each other for the next couple hundred years. And eventually, all of them would succumb to the new rising power in the West, which was in the Italian peninsula, and that was the Romans. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I really appreciate the time. I hope you learned something and had some fun along the way. The next series, I'm going to pick up on the Romans, and if you're into liking and subscribing, that would be awesome if you could do that. So, yeah, that's it. I hope we had fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.